Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome,
Hey,
welcome.
everybody.
My name is Meredith Gershenson. I'm a research analyst here at workforce.com. And today, as the title suggests, we're going to talk a little bit about how to prevent employee absenteeism. I am joined back at it again with Dr. Brad Shuck. Dr. Brad, thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. I was so excited after our last webinar. I could not wait to get back with you. This is going to be so much fun over the next hour.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, we definitely covered a lot with our last one. For those who didn't make the last one or unsure of it, we had Dr. Shuck on for a webinar on how to reduce no call, no shows. You can find that actually just on our website for the recording. But quickly, to give a little background on Brad, he is a co-founder at Org Vitals and program director at University of Louisville. He is an internationally recognized thought leader in the areas of employee engagement, leadership, and employee health and well-being. He has worked with leaders in virtually every industry throughout the public and private sectors across 4 continents. His insights are widely applied in both of the world's largest Fortune 500 and Fortune 50 companies, as well as small and medium-sized organizations seeking to grow and empower employees. We were talking a little bit about this earlier, Brad, that, your background is very much rooted in engagement and preventing absenteeism. So this is like your bread and butter right here. We've got
Yeah,
it covered.
this is a perfect synergy of where I've spent the last real 2 decades kind of
Yeah.
digging into why do people lean into work? Why do sometimes they push away from the table? And how do we prevent things like absenteeism? How do we promote things like health and well-being? So
Yeah.
I'm excited about this topic today.
This is awesome. And we're going to go all into everything and more with this one. Quickly, before we get into that, I know some of you
Yeah.
have been here already. We do have our chat box to the right. I see Nicholas, Brian, Karen, you guys already got it. I would love to hear where you're coming in from. Personally, I'm coming in from Chicago, where we're finally hitting warm weather, and it's only end of June. So I am thrilled we have made it on the other side where it's actually a good 70s. I would love to hear where you guys are coming in from. Feel free also in that chat box to throw in any questions that you guys have throughout the webinar. We'll have a last 15 minutes of the webinar dedicated to a Q&A section with Brad. So feel free to stick around for that. And again, I will tag those questions and put it in the Q&A section. We also have a couple poll questions throughout the webinar. Those will just slide up on your screen. It's a really awesome way for us to kind of see where everyone's heads are at, interact with you all. So be sure to interact with those. And finally, we do have a little handout. I like to give a little goodie bag at the end of these webinars. We have a handout from Lattice. It's a really great article and white paper on why work-life balance is important and how HR teams can improve it. We always love those actionable solutions here. This is awesome. Also, you guys throwing everything in the chat. This is really great. This is awesome. San Diego, I love it. Awesome. Really great to have you guys. And then finally, for those who are here for the HRCI and SHRM PDC IDs, feel free to stick around for the very end of the webinar because I'm going to be handing those out and calling them out at the very end there. So if you're watching it live, I'm happy to share those with you. And finally, a little bit of background on workforce.com. We are an HCM software company that specializes in businesses with hourly staff. So think hospitality, healthcare, retail, you name it, we're covering it. And really, we just run these webinar series to give you guys the latest insights and learnings from our own clients and data. Awesome. Great. Now that we got all the busy work out of the way, Brad, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your career at University of Louisville and how it contributes to workplace trends such as absenteeism.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started at the University of Louisville about 15 years ago, but was at Florida International University in Miami, Florida prior to that. And I really got interested in this idea that was emerging around employee engagement. And I've spent my whole career trying to understand and really dissect, what does that mean? How do we measure it? Why does it matter to not only the organization, but also to individual employees? And how do we create spaces of work that really help people live better lives through their work, not just come to work? It's just not something that we do every day, but we can actually we can thrive from that. So all of the research that I've done has been centered on turnover, absenteeism, production, performance, and then increasingly, we'll talk about this later in the webinar, around the health and well-being space and how work is impacting people physically and mentally when it comes to their own sense of well-being and welfare.
Any other trends that you've noticed specifically within these shift-based workforces?
Yeah, so I've worked with companies over the last couple of months around just like general workplace trends, and there are things like belonging and connection and isolation and integration. But when we look at shift-based workforces specifically, there are three real notable trends that we're seeing in the field. The first is the emergence of flexible scheduling and work arrangements. What we're seeing is that shift-based workforces are increasingly embracing flexible scheduling options where that's feasible. And I think that's an important point to know. They're implementing strategies like shift swapping. There's technology developed around that, self-scheduling, remote and hybrid work, where those options are flexible and feasible. The second, and workforce.com knows a lot about the second trend, is workforce management technology and how organizations are leveraging advanced scheduling systems through software that helps folks track time and provides employees kind of self-service options. We're seeing that really, really emerge in the non-desk worker space and the shift-based worker space. And then the third, something that's really important to me, is this focus on employee well-being and employee engagement. What we're seeing in the field is that organizations are increasingly recognizing the importance of well-being. First of all, where it's getting elevated in the conversations, which is probably long overdue, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about health and connection between work, like we can't divorce ourselves from those spaces. But now it's being recognized across the industry, and we're seeing investments in those areas. Things like employee assistance programs, learning and development, recognition programs, data analytics and predictive analytics. And that's been amazing. I'll say this last thing, in that it's important to note that trends can vary across industries and organizations. So no one trend fits everything. But for the work, specifically shift-based work industry, these three trends really highlight, I think, the evolving landscape. Like, it's changing right now that shift-based workforces are increasingly facing. There's an emphasis, if I was to sum it all up, on flexibility, technology, and the integration of well-being.
I mean, perfectly summarized, to say the least. And yeah, to emphasize points 1 and 2, like that's exactly what we at Workforce do. And we see a lot of this firsthand where people are switching out from their Excel spreadsheets and a really granted, it involves some sort of level of technology. I'm not going to say it's super old school. We've seen people go from pen and paper to working with us and our all-in-one system, and everything from our scheduling and time and attendance to the flexible, scheduling aspect to swapping shifts, and feeling like, oh, wow, this is game changing, and the employees love it. And especially, we've had a lot of discussions about working with these younger employees who are averaging age, like in the hospitality industry, anywhere from like 16 to early 20s. And they are used to having that aspect of technology to back them up and to give them some sort of autonomy. Yeah.
That's right. So, I mean, even my 12-year-old daughter, like, she can work an iPhone and an iPad.
Oh,
light years ahead of me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's what she grew up with. It's what she's used to. So
right. Oh, it's so true. I know. I mean, kids are practically born with a phone in their hand. So yeah, exactly. That's what they're used to. Last time we were on, for those who are coming on now, we were talking a little bit about how you were on our webinar on how to reduce no-call, no-shows. And I want to kind of go into a little bit of the specifics there. So what's the difference between no-call, no-shows and absenteeism, just to clarify?
So it's a great question. And the terms are sometimes used interchangeably and synonymously, but there is a key difference here. And that difference lies in communication. So as I was kind of doing some background research, I came across the statistic from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They suggested that every day, and they did this work just a year ago, every day, 114,000 employees skip out on work in a given day. So think about like I would imagine folks on the webinar are like, oh yeah, that happens here all the time, right?
Yeah.
Think about the compounding effect of that is unbelievable. So To differentiate the two terms, a no-call, no-show is when an employee fails to report to work. They're scheduled and they provide no notification or explanation at all. They're a no-call, no-show. So they don't show up. Absenteeism refers to a habitual pattern where of frequent absence from work without a valid reason or proper authorization. So the difference here lies in communication. A no call, no show, the employee fails to communicate whatsoever. Like, I'm just not telling you anything. The absence is completely unscheduled without any notification. Whereas absenteeism generally implies that someone has been informed. It's oftentimes the employer about the absence in advance, even if that happens repeatedly or without valid reasons.
Yeah. So when we're talking absenteeism, what are some of those contributing factors that, HR and operations GMs might see that really contribute to it?
Yeah. So when we look at this from a shift-based industry perspective, there are several contributing factors that tend to go overlooked in practice. Now, I want to highlight like how this has to feel in the moment, right? So like I'm a manager, I'm a leader, I'm trying to get some stuff done. I'm trying to run an operation. I'm trying to run my shift. Like it can feel a little chaotic in the moment, and I want to recognize those that are on the webinar and the call today. Like this can be a difficult time. There are some contributing factors, and I think it's important for us to take a look at these. These are oftentimes overlooked factors. The first one is fatigue and workload. I hear this all the time. Shift work can be particularly mentally demanding and for some physically demanding, and that oftentimes can lead to fatigue and burnout. That's where we see people become absent, right? The second is work-life balance challenges. Shift work can absolutely pose challenges to maintaining what I might call a healthy work-life integration. Balance may be more difficult, but integrating that work-life system could be challenging when I'm involved in shift work. What we find is that employees tend to struggle with balancing work commitments, their family commitments. Maybe they have childcare commitments, or they're a primary caregiver for an aging adult. That can become a problem. The third is communication and engagement. Because shift work can be variable, oftentimes communication can be difficult. And if communication isn't clear, what we find is that engagement can wane. And so employees working different shifts may have limited opportunities to really engage with supervisors or colleagues or receive the timely updates that they need, which is why the technology becomes really, really important, which is connected to the next one around workforce planning and staffing. Insufficient staffing levels. Look, I know everybody is dealing with this right now, where there is a labor shortage. And there's lots of reasons for that. There's lots of instability all over the place. The planning and staffing, if you can get a hold of that, it can really, really be a competitive advantage, because insufficient staffing levels or improper shift coverage can really place an additional burden of stress on those who are showing up. What happens is people compensate that, and that increases the likelihood for absenteeism. The last two I'll be brief on is around health and well-being support. We talked about this as a trend up at the top of the hour. This is becoming a significant competitive advantage. And organizations and leaders who are really harnessing the power of elevating health and well-being are really seeing dividends from that. And then the last piece of that is training and skill development. What we see is that in shift work, there can be insufficient training and skill development, and that can contribute to absenteeism because I don't feel competent in my job. Meredith, let me mention one last thing. And this is perhaps a sensitive topic, and that is for some of the folks who we're working with, there can be difficulties with housing and food. So think about if I am food insecure or transportation insecure, or I don't have stable housing, we can see that really impact things like absenteeism, because I'm I'm concerned about these other primary areas of my life. And if I'm a member of a family, or I'm a single parent, or I'm a part of a multi-generational family, difficulties with food, housing, and transportation can significantly impact absenteeism.
That's such a good point. And I think it's often overlooked. We've had a couple webinars in the past where there's like this continuous theme of communicating and making small talk cool again.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
like
yeah,
those are the details that you would probably not get unless you're like actually having authentic conversations with your staff. And it's it's honestly a lot easier said than done, quite frankly, to get close with like your shift based workforce and feeling
absolutely.
like, okay, they're going to like open up to me and it's going to be great. I'm going to learn this about them and know what's going on in order to pinpoint what's happening, like whether it's at home, whether it's in the office, whatever it might be. I quickly want to point to this poll question. I asked, what do you
Mm.
believe is a primary cause of employee absenteeism in your organization's hourly wage workforce? And we got around 10 responses. 40% are saying poor employee engagement and job satisfaction, which really feeds into what you were saying about, well-being and of course engagement. And it seems to be very reflected in, exactly what we're talking about here today.
Yep.
I want to quickly point to the chat. Mike said, I think the term work-life balance is outdated and likely impossible to achieve. I like to use and refer to work and life should work in harmony and strategize and make this happen.
I
I think
love that.
resiliency is key to achieving this harmony. I think that's such a good point, Mike.
Yep. Agreed.
Awesome. I want to also open up this first slide that we have. And we kind of talked a little bit about it already, and pinpointing some of those characteristics on really what to look out for when it comes to an unengaged employee or an employee that's going to really, put in a lot of PTO or have a lot of shift swapping to begin with. Is this something that is similar to what you're seeing out in your own research and just in some of the organizations you're working with, Brad?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I look at number two, shifts in attitude and kind of an unenthusiastic behavior. When we're engaged, we're leaning in, right? And engagement has to have a target, and so there's got to be clear communication, clear expectations and roles. But when we see an attitude change, number two, number three, we're really seeing this play itself out in the research. And then also number five. So I'm thinking about maybe a single parent who is food insecure, the inability to focus here. I mean, we think about how I'm thinking about where the next meal is going to come from, or how I'm going to get home from work, or childcare issues or challenges that I'm having. These are absolutely perhaps like warning signs, red flags, where if you're noticing some of this, you might step in, hey, how's it going? Can I help you with anything? Do you need support? Do you need to, take a quick 10, 15-minute break? I noticed you're having difficulty focusing here. You need to step out, make a quick phone call. Is there something going on? But I'm with you, Meredith. I think having those authentic conversations are really important, and they don't happen like a light switch. It's something that builds over time. It's a cumulative build. So it isn't something that we can mandate. There's not a policy around it. We can't make it happen, but we can create the conditions for that authenticity to really live and thrive in our shift-based organizations.
I think that's such a good point. And also passing a little bit of that weight over to your managers is huge. We're seeing a lot of HR and just organizations actually investing in some communication courses for their managers, and just really basic, nothing like college level prices or anything like that. Something really, really basic that we're talking that can help in the long run with managers and making sure that they're keeping an eye out for these types of characteristics that we're seeing on the screen. They're keeping an eye out for those that are tuning out, are really not really seemingly focused on what they're doing, kind of just going through the motions, calling out of work a lot, whatever it might be, and making sure that they're, like having that perspective just as much as you are, because typically with HR, it's usually one person within that space who is having to keep an eye out on everything that's going on. And that's impossible. And we don't want that for, our HR folks. What about organizational or managerial practices? Are there any in terms of that can inadvertently contribute to higher rates of absenteeism within these industries that we're talking about?
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. So we might think about chronic employee absenteeism, and the factors that are really associated with that are around things like disconnection and isolation. So
Mhm.
if someone feels disconnected from the organization, they don't feel a part of. If I'm just a piece of something larger, and I can't see a direct line of sight to how my work is connecting to something valuable,
Yeah.
or I don't feel like I have a work community, I'm disconnected from that. We can expect to see high rates of absenteeism, a lack of employee engagement, poor leadership, communication challenges, burnout, or a lack of work-life harmony, like Mike said. And then another one is, again, a little sensitive talk about feeling harassed. If someone feels like they're in I'm not going to say a hostile work environment, but if they feel like they are the target of some level of harassment, we can see people begin to really call out more, be absent more, and
Yeah.
even works its way over into no call, no shows.
Mm. That's a good point. And again, kind of going back to Mike's comment, talking about work life balance
Yeah,
and maybe switching the script to a work life harmony, which I love. It's never going to be a balanced relationship. There's going to be seasons to how employees are going to be feeling about their job. And again, that really does contribute to how it is about, what's going on at home, what's going to go on in their personal life, what's going on
yeah,
outside of the office, outside of
that's right.
work, right? And
That's right.
that contributes to the idea of balance. You can't give 50-50 every time. Sometimes it's going to be 90-10. Other times it's going to be the other way around. And, they might
Yeah,
really feel like they need to throw themselves into their work. So it's
absolutely.
never work-life balance. And I think calling that out to begin with is awesome. So good on you, Mike. I love that.
Get it, Mike.
Yeah, exactly. What are some subliminal ways that, HR ops managers contribute to those practices and kind of steer them away from wanting to be at work to begin with? What are some minimal things that they're doing that might, again, inadvertently contribute?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to go back to the communication inconsistency,
Yeah.
some poor leadership, and maybe a lack of training in those areas. And so on that note, I think it's really important that we have robust training programs, not only for our managers and our leaders, but making sure that that all of our employees feel like they're learning and they're growing and they're developing. I love some of the shift-based organizations that I've seen. Some of their recruitment materials are, let us help you get better. Like,
Mhm.
we know we may not be your stop. We may be. You may want to work for this organization for the rest of your life, but let us help you be a terrific employee in a first step. And so a robust training and development program, I think, is really, really important.
Mhm.
I also think HR needs to be at the table. And if HR
Yeah.
is not at the table, you're missing out on an important partner when we think about strategy and effectiveness. There's a real key piece of your leadership team that's missing there. I think about communication, I think about flexibility, and I think about analytics and how analytics is beginning to help us understand the employee experience. And so we're thinking about the onboarding piece of that. We're thinking about the first 30 days, the first 90 days, who's connecting, what are the touch points with that. Analytics can really help us understand what's going on. But despite all of the fever around things like Chat GPT, which is a fantastic technology that my students at the university are learning how to use really, really
Oh, I'm
well,
sure.
no doubt about it, I think there's always going to be a need for a human, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's always going to be a need for a personal touch, someone to understand the data, make sense of the patterns that we're seeing. And so while AI is on the rise and we're seeing that utilized in shift-based work organizations,
Mhm.
I think we're always going to need human beings. And then just things like a very clear attendance policy that's understood. I'm going to go back to what Brene Brown said, clear is kind.
Yeah.
And so when your attendance policy is clear And I have there's a radio personality here in Kentucky that says a rule is not a rule unless it has a consequence. So you want to like lay that stuff out to make sure that everybody understands what the expectation, what the left and right limit is, and making sure that that policy is just really, really clear.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned having HR have a seat at the table. What's the best way for that to happen? What is something that HR should maybe come equipped with at this table? Should they have hard numbers? Should they just have, more testimonial type things? What's the best way?
So my experience in this is that data changes the conversation.
Yeah.
I can tell you how I feel all day. But when I've got hard data and I can integrate that data into the conversation around performance or P&L or how the organizational effectiveness or strategy or thinking, years out, now HR has a seat at the table because we can show that it's like the number I had earlier, 140,000 people don't show up for work every day across the United States. If we extrapolate that on like performance, and Gallup has done some of this work and could be helpful, that data changes the conversation in the boardroom. But I also think HR has been elevated post COVID into a position of strategy.
Yeah.
And we recognized that culture is really important. Well-being is really important, that we've got to be having different kinds of conversations about our employees and their experience of work because it impacts everything. And the data is very clear and supportive of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And in fact, we've been getting a lot of feedback with these webinars and doing more on having a strong culture and how to cultivate that. And I think it's a hard topic to tackle. You can go a lot of different directions with it. It's super broad. But there's a need for it. And it's funny to see people coming back to it because for a while it wasn't even a focus on culture. It was a focus on how are we going to keep our employees? Like we need to do everything that we can to make sure that they're not turning over, to make sure that they're not quiet quitting, whatever it might be. And now we're kind of taking a step back and being like, okay, let's reevaluate a little bit. What's contributing to this? What's the mental health aspect that's here? About engagement, all of that stuff. So again, Brad, we were talking about this earlier before we even went live, and it's really just like a snowball effect. It's a cycle, and all of it kind of is in the same realm and is impacting each other. So it's very interesting.
Totally agree. Yeah, totally agree.
Awesome. With going back to work-life balance techniques, work-life harmony, as Mike says, I want to ask, how can our organizations effectively address the root cause of absenteeism, such as stress, job satisfaction, whatever it might be, or even, lack of work-life balance?
Yeah. So there are a couple of things. So again, we're going to highlight Mike's really insightful idea here of this idea of harmony and being able to meet all of the competing responsibilities that I might have at a given time. And I want to recognize that for shift workers, this can be really difficult. The challenges around that revolve with irregular hours, frequent changes to schedules, which impacts social time. It impacts family time. It also impacts our biological clock. And there's something I came across called, and Meredith, I'm sure you've heard of this, shift work sleep disorder, which is where our circadian rhythm gets disrupted as a result of changing times. And I've seen this firsthand with some of the emergency responders that I've worked with. So firefighters, paramedics, police officers who work different shifts, but also in the automotive industry as well, where shifts can change. And it's really interesting to me that our body could biologically respond in unique and different ways depending on what that shift looks like. When I think about how do we reduce, right? So let's talk about like some things that we can do to get over that hump and to not have these as a hurdle. I think about the role of technology and how technology is helping us in this space. So for example, automated attendance tracking. So this is technology that enables biometric scanners or swipe cards or mobile apps or all-in-one communication strategies that helps reduce errors and miscalculations. I think about things like management software, so attendance or absence management software, where we talk about things like shift swapping, where someone can go peer-to-peer to swap a shift. They can request digital transfers. Supervisors can review kind of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
I think about remote work and telecommuting and what that might look like for shift workers, which is something we haven't really talked about yet. I think I think about remote work and hybrid work like a tube of toothpaste. So during COVID, everybody kind of, I was working with a really big call center for a logistics and transportation company, and they sent all of their workers home. And then afterwards, they brought them all back in, and they were a little disgruntled about that. And I don't know if you've ever tried to put like toothpaste back in the tube after you've squeezed it out, but it's very difficult to do, and it's kind of messy.
Impossible.
It's impossible. It's kind of sticky. And I think about the role of remote work and telecommuting today is so much different than it was 10 years ago. There isn't a best strategy. So there isn't like, you need to do this. The best strategy is the strategy that works for your organization, whatever that might be, right? But again, clear is kind. You want to be clear about the intention and the left and right limits on that. But there is technology that is enabling remote work options. And I think that may be a way, particularly for those who are dealing with some of the challenges and overlooked contributing factors that we talked about earlier. This could be a novel solution. And I can hear it already. I was in a conversation a week ago around what we're calling a work location policy, not a work from home or remote work policy, but like, where do we get the work done? So it's been interesting. And then employee engagement platforms are ways that organizations can really ensure that communication is consistent, recognition is consistent, engagement is consistent, and kind of looking at how we're engaging employees through even social collaborations and how people are connecting across the workforce. To your point about like the small talk piece, we've probably missed a little bit of that over the last couple of years.
I mean, it's like a muscle, and I think COVID kind of didn't exercise it at all.
Yeah.
And it was, I mean, at least it was very hard to, especially with shift-based workforces where, of course, they were like the healthcare industry, right? I mean, that was something where they took a huge hit and in a lot of different ways. So it's really difficult. Mike said, speaking of healthcare, Mike said, we are partnered with our local health system for our wellness plan during 2022. I asked them to present on a variety of mental health topics related to wellness and included a presentation on resiliency. I find employees who are less resilient than others contribute more than the absenteeism problem. That is so smart. I love that you collaborated with your local health system. I think that's really genius and something where it creates almost like a boundary of like, here is the baseline of where we need you guys, and here's something that can help. And it just so happens to be in our own backyard. So that's really awesome, Mike. I want to quickly point to this second slide. Here are like some really, kind of going back to that original question of some of those root causes. A really simple 5-step process that we actually got from Lattice. And this is directly from that handout that we'll pass around at the very end. But talking a little bit about like steps 1 through 5, 1 being secure buy-in from business leadership. That is really big. And again, having that seat at the table, as Brad said, is super important. Communicating clear work policies. That is, again, technology comes into play. Like I know with Workforce, we're able to like upload the entire employee handout for employees to be able to access on their phone. That's huge. Step 3, consider employee recognition. That is huge. And again, it kind of feeds into that aspect of loyalty and making sure, hey, they also have a seat at the table in a sense. Step 4, train your managers. That's a really big one we talked a little bit about earlier, where training your managers and making sure that they also have the tools in their own tool belt to be able to address head on, hey, this employee, this team is really having a hard time. Instead of maybe making it, I'm going to go straight to HR and make sure that they're handling it. What can they do to help support it and maybe even ease off on a little bit of, what is on the workload of HR? And step 5, monitor results with employee surveys. surveying and feedback is huge. In fact, it's actually one of like the biggest features used in our own product, where after each shift, you can send out a feedback survey to your employees' apps, to their phones, being like, hey, what'd you think of today? Like a quick 2-question survey. That's all it takes. And having that, again, gives that seat to HR at the table. It really puts them in the driver's seat. Awesome. I want to talk a little bit about how companies can promote work-life balance within their own companies.
Yep.
Brad, what do you
Yeah.
think about that?
Yeah. So first of all, I love the steps here that you've got. I mean, this is just laid out so nicely, and to highlight the role of recognition, so important. Listen, when people feel seen, and this isn't, we're not talking like, you're handing out $100 gift cards to everybody, but just recognizing someone to say, hey, I saw you. Hey, you crushed it today. Really great job. I love the idea of the quick pulse after shifts. Something like that can be automated. So your employees get into a routine of, on a scale from 1 to 5, how was my shift today? 2, 3, and you can see the trends over time.
Yeah.
And that can really give your leaders and your managers information that is helpful in preparing for the next shift, and finding out, what might be going on. All right. Work-life balance. When we think about the idea of work-life harmony, I have a couple of suggestions on that. Well, first of all, to the degree it's possible, flexible work arrangements. Where you can and when you can, offering flexible work options such as schedules, compressed work weeks, telecommuting, remote work, whatever that might look like. This would allow an employee to better manage some of their own personal commitments. And we are seeing an integration of work and life in a way that we haven't. And I actually think that's exciting. And I think it's a really healthy thing that we're seeing integration and harmony in ways that promote the whole person. I think that's important. The second, clear policies and expectations. We talked about that. Clear is kind. If we don't understand the policy, we don't understand the expectation, I'm likely to be absent. Even if I'm not physically absent, I might be mentally absent because I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing.
Right.
Culture. Supportive culture would be the third thing. Fostering a supportive work culture that values work-life harmony, that encourages managers to prioritize their own sense of well-being, to promote open communication, and discourage kind of an always-on mentality is important. You asked everybody where they were logging in from earlier, and I forgot to tell you where I am. I'm at the beach right now. So I'm on vacation. And my wife this morning was like, are you gonna get off your phone? I mean, you're checking emails at the beach. And I was like, I am. There's this sense of always on mentality, which actually isn't healthy for us when we think about harmony in those areas. I also think about wellness programs and how wellness programs provide resources around things like education. So, and think outside the non-traditional box. What about if we looked at financial education or real estate education, or we taught people how to grow gardens, or we upskilled them in areas that weren't directly related to their jobs, but would help the company. Those things can really reduce stress management. Think about exercise, nutrition, mindfulness, resiliency. Those become really important. And then, Meredith, you've already talked about this. It's managerial support and training. Mm-hmm. We've got to give our first line leaders and our mid-level managers the tools they need to be successful. And that looks like providing training and support on ways that promote and can even talk about work-life harmony with their teams. I love the idea of basic communication training. Like, how do you have these kinds of we take for granted that these things are easy to do, but sometimes they're not, and they can be difficult to do. And so providing training in these areas, I think, can be really, really important and impactful.
You covered some really awesome, like, top big picture topical aspects on, cultivating a strong culture and like communication. What are some smaller, like, actionable solutions, some small strategies that HR can even implement, like, right after this webinar, theoretically, that you might recommend?
Yeah, so I love the idea, I mentioned it earlier, of something called the cumulative principle, which a lot of my research is kind of grounded in. And that is almost everything in our life is governed by the really small decisions that we make every day. And they either work for us or they work against us. And so I think about something that's really, really small that you could do immediately after this webinar would be, you have somebody that you've been meaning to reach out to for the last 3 weeks. You haven't gotten a chance to do that. Send them an email. Send them a 2-sentence email right after this,
Yeah.
and let them know, hey, you did a great job, or you really crushed it in this meeting, or man, you thank you for showing up and filling in for this person because it helped our team do XYZ. The more specificity that you can give it, do it. I always say, send the text, send the email, make the phone call. It takes almost no time.
Mm-hmm.
You could, if you're at work right now, get up and walk around and just like take 10 minutes. And I used to do this. And I would always think like, this doesn't matter. Like nobody wants to see me, right? Walking around the floor. But the truth of the matter is your presence is really, really important. And people take cues from you and your
That's
work.
so interesting.
And so walk around, just,
Yeah.
get up, take 10, 15 minutes and go do that. Those are 2 really quick strategies that people could implement right now that I guarantee will increase engagement, will help people feel more recognized, and will begin to set the parameters for harmony in ways that maybe they didn't 15 minutes before.
I love that. That's so smart. And again, there's some serious scientific evidence to all of those things,
Absolutely.
whether we're talking about like just being there and being in person and being present and walking around and like getting out of your office.
Yep.
And even just small little changes like that make such a big difference. And I think that's just so smart. I want to turn quickly to this slide, our last slide here. We have what leaders can offer. And my question for you, Brad, is what role does leadership have in promoting work-life harmony and preventing burnout in these, shift-based industries?
Yeah. So I love that question. Some of the newest work that we're doing right now is around a model, and Meredith, you and I haven't talked about this yet, a model that we call above the line leadership. And there's a series of behaviors. It's very behaviorally based. But when we asked leaders about, well, where did you learn that? Where did you first see that happen? They would tell stories about leaders in their past or people who influenced their life that they saw them do those things. So I would want to go back to something I just said, and that is your presence matters on your team. Like it matters a lot because people are looking at you and taking their cues, and they may not know that work life can be harmonious. They may not know what support looks like. They may not know what great leadership looks like. And they're learning that in the moment as they watch you kind of walk around.
Mm-hmm.
And so leadership sets the tone for this. They set the positive example, and we have got to prioritize our own work-life harmony and our own healthy mental models before we can expect other people to do those things. We've got to kind of work on that ourselves in some ways. That's going to take some time. It's going to take some reflection. I would encourage you to do that. I think creating a supportive culture, leaders set the tone for that as well, and they foster a culture that supports work-life harmony in ways that there are boundaries and left and right limits around things. I think it's really, really important to set clear expectations. I've recently worked on some teams that did not have clear expectations, and they were looking to the leader to provide those. And the leader was listening, and they thought listening was leadership. And to a degree, yes. But I also think that it's important for a leader to establish a clear set of defined expectations around things regarding work hours and overtime and time off policies, and being very clear about those things and setting policies in place that are clear and kind. I also think about training and development, and we've talked about that and the importance of making sure that people feel competent and a part of, and that they can do their work. We, in the field of behavioral economics, that's called idiosyncratic fit. And it means that I believe I can do my job. I have the resources and skills to do my job, but also that I can be good at my job. Nobody wants to be terrible at their job. Nobody wants to feel like they don't have the resources to do their work. And so training and development can become a real key piece in moving the needle on reducing absenteeism, because people not only believe that they can do their work, but they can be really great at their work.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I'm so curious about that above the line managing and leadership. And I found this awesome article. I'll send it in the chat. And for those that want to kind of go a little more into the nuances there, this seems like a really great article to help explain that. How can leaders support the employees' well-being and create a positive work environment? And, going more into specifics of cultivating that stronger culture, what would you recommend there?
Yeah, in terms of leadership specifically,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's being very mindful and being very present.
Okay.
I think being present, being intentional, working from a place of dignity, working from a place of authenticity and presence, becomes really an important tool in a leader's toolkit that helps them lead their teams in moments. And we need leaders and we need managers to step up to the plate in those areas where it is a little chaotic and confusing. And so being present and mindful is important, but you have to establish those boundaries beforehand, right? It's not something that we flip on like a light switch. So
Sure.
being a default mode, I think, is really important.
I asked a poll question a couple of minutes ago, and it really feeds into that. I asked, what do you believe is the biggest barrier to challenging and effectively preventing employee absenteeism within your workforce? And a lot of people are saying difficulty in balancing employee flexibility with ensuring proper shift coverage. And again, that there's an aspect of that admin work where technology like workforce, like what we do, comes into play in helping offload some of that on, off your plate and making sure that you can remain present. And I think that's such a big component, making sure that, hey, employees can easily do that on their own time, swap shifts just simply on their phone, and making sure that managers aren't having to get bogged down with it and can remain present. Like Brad said, I think that's such a good point. Brad, my question for you, kind of switching the script a little bit from work-life harmony to addressing absenteeism more proactively, kind of getting ahead of the curve. So how can organizations implement clear attendance expectations and policies without being too rigid? Because there is something to be said about having too, tight of a leash around this kind of stuff.
There's no question about that. And rigidity can inadvertently cause a sense of absenteeism and disengagement at times. And so I love the idea of developing this in a way that is that bends but doesn't break, if that makes sense. And I think I would offer really 5 key areas. The first is, if you've not yet done so, developing a comprehensive attendance policy, I think, is really, really important. And it needs to be well-defined, and it needs to outline the expectations in a really clear way. The expectations, the rules, and the procedures related to attendance. So, for example, if I implement shift swapping technology in my organization, maybe one of the expectations is, well, listen, if you don't swap your shift, you have to come in. Like, just because you want to swap your shift doesn't mean you're off the hook on this, right? So it's up to you to find someone to swap that shift with. The second would be to define the attendance requirements, and that's different than a policy. Requirements really help define what's required in terms of work hours, start and end times, lunch breaks, any specific attendance related rules, anything like that that might be relevant to the organization or the industry. The third is specifying attendance reporting procedures. I think it's important to specify and clearly communicate how we report absences. What's the expectation? How are you going to communicate that? What does that look like? Is it a phone call? Is it an email? Is it an online system? Is it all of the above? Can you text somebody? Like, what's expected there?
Mm-hmm.
The fourth is to differentiate excused absences from unexcused absences. And this is a big deal. And I've run into this even like my daughter missing school, right? Or my wife needing to call in. She's a teacher. Unexcused versus excused absences are 2 qualitatively different things. Excused absences might be things like, look, I'm sick, I'm ill, I've got a family emergency. I had a student call me one time to tell me that they were going to miss class that day because they were a teller at a bank that just got robbed. And I was like, listen, you go home and be with your family. Do not come to class today.
Take your time. You do what you need to do.
You're fine. Like, it's excused. It's not a problem. Unexcused absences are those things that don't meet whatever your established criteria might be.
Yeah.
And so it's important to distinguish between those things. And then I would outline any kind of actions that when someone breaches the agreed upon expectations, what is the impact? Again, I'm going to go back. A rule is not a rule without a consequence. And so if you don't have some kind of a consequence or disciplinary action at the end of something, if someone goes outside the left and right limit, then you really don't have a policy. You have a guideline. Mm-hmm. And guidelines are very different from policies.
There's so many directions I want to go. First and foremost, taking all that in consideration, is there like a baseline attendance policy that you recommend all organizations, no matter, what industry, should have in place? Or is there not any such thing as that kind of catch-all?
I think in many ways it's very industry, and it might even be like shift dependent in some places. I think it depends on, like, when someone doesn't show up, or there's a series of unexcused absences, right? And we're talking about absenteeism, somebody who know about it, but they're not coming in. What is the impact of them not coming in on the business? Is there a probationary period? Is there a 30, 60, 90-day probationary period? I've worked with some organizations that if you have 2 unexcused absences in your 90-day probation period, then they terminate your employment. It's going to depend on the labor market. It's going to depend on the industry. It's going to depend on the impact of the shift. I like the rule of 3. I think 3 is something we've all kind of grown up with. Like, I don't know, my parents used to say, look, you got 3 strikes and you're out. If somebody has 3 unexcused absences, then that may be a good rule of thumb, but it's not going to work for everybody. I differentiate, and I think a more human-centered organization may differentiate between excused and unexcused absences, like the example I just gave you. Mm-hmm. Legitimate excuse, had a bank robbery, can't come to class. Cool, not a problem. If I'm sick every Tuesday at 11,
right,
maybe there's a pattern here, right? If there's a sense that someone is bending the rules on stuff, I would invest. And I'd go back to the slide you talked about earlier. An unengaged attitude, kind of stepping back, inability to focus. Those could be early warning signs for folks.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. I asked a short response poll question asking, do you have any policies in place for your managers or HR, including absenteeism? If so, what do those look like? And it's actually really interesting. Some people are saying, we're a pretty small company, so we don't really have anything in place. We're like less than 5 employees, so there's no policy. We're pretty lax. It can be better. We have a points-based attendance system, which is really interesting. We actually just came out with a points-based attendance system within our product, and it's impressive to see how that's being utilized and how much people actually really love it. And some people say somebody said, yes, we have the 3 days, no call, no shows, automatic termination. Also, we follow progressive disciplinary policy. Again, perfect. It's implementing whatever policies make sense and using technology, using workforce to help provide and, cultivate that aspect of that policy and making sure that these employees are brought up with this policy, considering how the average age of these staff members, it's usually their first job, maybe for some of them, it's their second or third, but it's interesting to see all these policies. And, for those that submitted those answers, thank you so much for sharing those. My last question for you, Brett, before we move on to the Q&A section, because I want to leave some time for that. We got some awesome questions in the chat. What are 1 or 2 top tips, actions, or takeaways that HR managers, ops can use to better prevent employee absenteeism at the end of the day?
Yep. I love this question. If I was going to say, here are two if you don't hear anything else, here are 2 takeaways. The first is I would encourage you to think about establishing what it might look like to establish a positive work environment. A positive work environment is absolutely crucial in reducing absenteeism. And in many ways, it's rolled up in some of the stuff we've already talked about. Being clear. I understand the expectations. I've got training and development opportunities. I've got a sense of work-life harmony. There's good communication. I feel like I'm recognized and rewarded for really great work. I have career opportunities. There's a sense of development opportunities. Fostering a positive work environment is absolutely, absolutely crucial. The second would be to implement absence management strategies. And we're going to go back and harp on this again. Track and analyze data. Track and analyze absence data. Track and analyze how people are using things like your employee assistance programs. I would establish clear attendance policies. And I would also provide something like a return to work support. So structured processes that support employees from returning from absences, especially when they're due to like things like illness, FMLA, caretaking, and offer accommodations where possible. But those would be my two takeaways. I cannot stress and highlight the importance of culture and the importance of having an absent management strategy in place for your organization.
That's such a good high point to end on. Thank you so much for sharing that,
Yeah,
Brad.
for sure.
I want to turn quickly to the Q&A section. If you have any questions, submit them in the chat. I will be sure to prioritize those live questions versus those that have actually been emailed in to us. Starting off, Bev asked an awesome question. Bev asked, we have generous sick and vacation leave accrual policies. My concern is a few employees who take the leave as soon as it's earned. If something major happens, they won't have paid leave available. How do I balance the communication so they consider the big picture without feeling harassed?
Yeah. That's a great question. So first of all, kudos to you for having generous leave policies that provide flexibility for employees. I can give you what I've recommended to other organizations, and that is if someone uses up all of their paid leave time off, and something happens to them, they get sick or they break their leg or something like that, or they have to care for a sick child or a parent. Putting a policy or putting a practice in place of allowing them to take the time, but the time is not paid, and allowing them. There's got to be a pain point that's associated with that. I would communicate that whatever works for you in that, communicating that I think is going to be key and really important. And saying, if you look, and maybe there's like an early warning trigger sign. I'm just thinking of this out loud, where if somebody uses 50% of their paid time off within the first 3 months of the year, there's a little trigger that comes up and says, hey, we want you to know, we know you're taking your time, which is awesome. Go use that. Go have a big time. But we just want to make sure that you know that if you use up all your time, if something happens later in the year and you don't have any paid time off, you can take that time, but that time is going to be taken without pay. I am a really, really big believer in that time off as a part of the compensation package. And I can use all that time if I want to, January 1st through January 15th. But once that paid time off is gone and it's burned through, it's burned through. There's now something on the other side of that and other decisions that need to be made. I hate telling people how to use their paid time off because people use it in a variety of different ways for their own personal purposes. But if something happens to someone, they need to take time off, they don't have any, I think allowing them to take that time off without pay is one solution. And I might even put in a stopgap where you can only do that 2 times over a certain period, so that people just aren't taking time off all the time, because now you have a bigger problem. You have a labor shortage that you're trying to deal with. I hope that's helpful, Bev. That's a great question.
No, that's such a good question. And I love the idea of, whether it's in the form of like a notification on the employee app or whatever it might be on whatever system you might be using, having that implemented would be really, really cool and a really great idea. If not, it might be a little bit harder, but kind of just manually tracking that from the HR standpoint and reaching out to them personally and say, just so you know, like just so here's a little reminder of our
Yeah.
attendance policy, and here's a little reminder of our PTO, and you're using 99% of it within the first 2 weeks of January. Just want to like give you a little heads up. Like
Yeah.
you're not going to be able to get any more this year. So whatever it might be, it might be a little harsh, but
Yeah.
I think that's such a good idea. I want to quickly go into this emailed in question from Caroline F. Caroline asked, we're having a hard time aligning HR and ops goals to a realistic level. What would you suggest for setting realistic and achievable performance targets or goals for our employees?
So I've thought a lot about this question. And what it's very fresh for me because I've found in some recent conversations that ops and HR are more aligned than they think they are, but they feel really misaligned
Yeah.
in some ways. And how both of these, maybe like a shared services operation, HR versus operations, which is like field management, can feel at odds at times. Some recommendations that I might make around this are collaborative goal setting. It looks like the power just went out here. Sorry about that. It's fine. Collaborative goal setting, which is important around helping people feel really connected and a part of. So how do we set these goals together? I would encourage us to break down goals into milestones. So rather than setting, what I find is that we set really like super long-term goals, right? Like we're going to set these things. Here's what we want to look like in 5 years. I would encourage us to think about that. That's important, but to break those down into really manageable milestones that we're checking in with each other every 3 to 6 months. I like to get ops and HR in the same room and each of them commit to something, and then I hold them accountable. So when I'm coaching an organization in this area, there's a sense of accountability that comes along with this because they have to give a presentation on whatever they said they were going to do at the next 3-month check-in meeting. And that becomes important. Regular feedback is also a part of that, providing clarity and guidance, support and resources, and then continuous evaluation and adjustment. There is not one time that I've gone into a goal setting session with an organization and strategic planning where we have not had to adjust our aim just a little bit based upon the business need or based upon what's going on. But getting those folks in the room, setting collaborative goals together, breaking those down into milestones, I think is a way to do that.
I think that's a good point. And again, making sure that those milestones are communicated really clearly with your frontline staff and your managers, like bringing everybody at the table that deserves to be there, which is everybody, because it's again, we're talking about harmony within their work life. It's a big chunk of their life is going to be work, and having a seat at the table, whether it's just in a small way of milestone setting is huge. It's huge. It really builds that loyalty, you guys. I want to quickly get to Brandy's question. I know we're over the hour mark. You guys are awesome for hanging in there. Brandy asks, how do you feel that different generational groups respond to work-life harmony policies? I love that. We're really putting on the work-life harmony. Guys, this is awesome.
Yeah.
Mike, shout out. There seems to be a clear difference in those who live to work and those who work to live. I have experienced resistance at the executive level when trying to address the engagement and balance issue for the work to live crowd.
Yeah. So really, really great question. And I'm just reading back through this, Brandy, really quickly. So here's what I love about this question, is we're not saying those kids or that generation, where there's no generational shaming here, which I think is really, really important, but rather maybe differences in what people need at certain times of their life and how each generation has learned to navigate the world of work. There's no question that in some organizations, those who are in executive leadership positions right now come from a generation that's 3 times removed, perhaps some of their frontline workers. And so rather than guessing about what people want or or how we need to address that engagement and balance issue, my recommendation would be to hold some focus groups and to ask and to talk to them.
Yes.
And you can totally use, like, if you have survey data that you've used, you can use that survey data to really develop questions that get to the heart of what's going on. And sometimes having an outside facilitator help you navigate that could result in perhaps more open and honest and authentic answers around that. But I would ask, I'm a big proponent of, hey, when we want to implement something new here, we want to implement something that's going to be awesome, asking those that are going to be directly impacted by the policy or the benefit is a really, really good best practice.
Mm-hmm. That's so great. It's such a good way to end this webinar. Brad, you're the best. Thank you so,
Amazing.
so much for coming on.
Of course.
I really quickly wanted to share the handout. Again, this is just something that we use for that second slide, those 5 steps. It's from Lattice. It's an awesome, awesome report. It really kind of puts together everything that we've talked about today very nicely. So feel free to check that out. And before we get to the SHRM PDC IDs, I'm going to stop this recording.